This is Core i9-12900HX engineering sample. Originally a laptop CPU that is based on 12900K silicon, redesigned by some Chinese guys to fit back into the desktop. The biggest feature of this CPU is that it ignores chipset limitations and it can be fully overclocked in any motherboard. It's reasonably affordable, and it was actually featured in one of the latest LTT videos.
He's using a mobile engineering sample CPU?
12900HX. HX.
They asked PC builders from Facebook to build them a computer, and this CPU was in one of the builds, but it wasn't configured properly. So gaming and performance results were not great. And one other thing.
Yeah, he also said that it would perform the same as a 12900K.
No.
And yes, it can be a 12900K, provided you provide a good motherboard and properly configure it. So in this video, I will tell you everything you want to know about this CPU if you want to build a system with it. What motherboard should you get, and what motherboard you absolutely should not get for this CPU. How easy or maybe not easy it is to install into the motherboard. We'll discuss what cooling solutions you should install if you plan to overclock it, and you absolutely should. What kind of a DDR4 and 5 problems it has. And we will absolutely discuss overclocking. And of course, we will see how good it is in gaming, and we will compare it to a Ryzen 7600, because if it can't compete with Ryzen, why bother getting this CPU in the first place? Let's begin. And it actually arrives in this box. Yes, Chinese guys decided to create a special box for it, and the box itself is actually decent quality. The box also contains these washers and screws because you need to modify the socket in order to install it, because this CPU actually gained a lot of weight during the winter and didn't have time to put itself in shape before the summer. Seriously though, because this is a laptop CPU, it uses BGA, it actually is soldered to the motherboard, so they soldered a second layer PCB in order to fit it back into the LGA socket, and because of that it's actually quite thicker. You absolutely need to modify the socket retention mechanism or else it will destroy the CPU. Is just too thick to fit out of the box. Though you can definitely try, but you know, if you kill your motherboard, then it's on you. The CPU will probably be dead too, so yeah, good luck. And you might be thinking, it's an engineering sample. Don't I need to modify the BIOS in order for it to work? And the answer is no. It works out of the box with any motherboard. CPU-Z detects that it's an engineering sample, but it just works because it's a 12900K silicon. But because it was originally designed for laptops, its power limits is severely crippled compared to 12900K. You absolutely need to enter the BIOS or use XTU in order to overclock this CPU. And if that's something you're not comfortable with, do not buy this CPU. The default power limits are 55 watts PL1 and 157 PL2. And you might be wondering, how long can it sustain 157 watts? And the answer is, well, not that long. Let's stress test this CPU in Cinebench R23 and see how long will it hold the 157 watt power limit. And if you think you have a few minutes and you can go make some tea and return and it will still be 152 watts, then no. The PL2 window is actually already over, and I really wanted to insert some kind of a sexual joke here where it's only 15 seconds of activity and then it barely stands, but you know, it's not that kind of a channel. You'll see just a little bit later that this 55 watt performance is terrible. The clocks are very low. You definitely need to overclock this thing in order to squeeze the maximum performance out of it. One other thing you're already probably asking is, it's a mobile chip, it doesn't have an integrated heat spreader. Yes, Chinese guys actually made a heat spreader for this CPU. There's a phase change thermal paste between the heat spreader and the CPU, and that actually limits the CPU in some ways, but you'll see that just a little bit later in the video. As I already said, you need to modify the CPU socket retention mechanism in order for this CPU to fit, and you can definitely use the original retention mechanism, but if you're using an early 600 series motherboard, maybe you want to upgrade your 12400 with this CPU, you might want to replace this retention mechanism with a frame. Early 600 series motherboards have retention mechanisms that just bend the CPU. If you uninstall your CPU and see that there's bending, you do not want to use the original retention mechanism. Use the frame instead, because a normal CPU would just bend, but because there's two layers of PCBs and they're soldered to each other, you might break those solder joints because of the retention mechanism problems. You need to uninstall the original retention mechanism in order to modify it. Make sure you have a proper screwdriver for that though. Then you place two washers, and yes, you need to place two washers per hole. And it actually isn't that easy because, well, the process, I really hated it. It actually took me like 10 minutes to install the frame with these goddamn things. It's actually a little easier if you're using the original socket retention mechanism, and it's slightly less easier with the frame. And you need to use longer screws that are provided with the CPU. And the end result looks something like this. And because the CPU is higher, installing a cooling solution is a lot more trickier. As you can see, my Deepcool all-in-one LT720 the original standoffs are, well, they're not high enough now. If I just screw it all the way in, I will probably over-tight it and damage the CPU pins with the CPU and probably break the CPU itself. Same thing with the air solution. The CPU is higher, so you cannot just screw it in all the way. You will apply way too much pressure on the CPU and will destroy the socket. You cannot screw all the way in. You need to use your head and screw, just enough for it to hold, but not enough for it to kill. This is a very tricky part, so be careful not to damage your CPU and motherboard. Now let's discuss motherboard compatibility, because as I already said, the CPU completely ignores chipset limitations. You can overclock the CPU and RAM even on H610 motherboard. So in order to better understand how this CPU behaves in different motherboards, I took a lot of motherboards and tested it. I don't have a lot of footage of that because I actually stream a lot on my native language channel and we tested everything there. I don't stream on this channel yet, but if you would like to see some English streams when we do some kind of a really cool stuff with all kinds of CPUs and motherboards, please subscribe to the channel. And it turns out with DDR5 4-DIMM motherboards, this CPU does not function properly. You probably know that the best place to put your RAM is the second and fourth memory slot. And if you do that with this CPU, the motherboard will just refuse to boot. If you have a postcode indicator on your motherboard, it will show postcode 54, which is memory initialization. But then it will just reboot and will be stuck every time on every reboot on postcode 54. However, if you move your memory sticks to slot 1 and 3, which is usually something you do not want to do, do not plug in your memory sticks into slot 1 and 3. It will severely cripple your memory overclocking capabilities. You absolutely want them installed in 2 and 4. In this case, it will actually work, but the memory speeds would be terrible. On AliExpress page, it's actually specified that you do not want to install it into a 4-DIMM DDR5 board. And in DDR5 case, it's absolutely true. You should not get this CPU with a 4-DIMM DDR5 motherboard. Just don't do it. It has been tested in 3 motherboards and it's always the same. The CPU fails to initialize in 2 and 4 and it boots with terrible memory speeds in 1 and 3. The best you can do is probably 4800 with terrible timing, so don't go this way. Do not install it in DDR5 4-DIMM motherboard. But it will work perfectly in a dual DIMM motherboard. It will boot without any problems and reach, well, reasonable speeds, as we will discuss a little bit later. But why wouldn't it properly work with 4-DIMM DDR5 motherboards? And after all the things I've done to this CPU, the answer is clear to me. Because the memory controller is not finished. It's an engineering sample, so Intel probably with this iteration didn't have all the problems with DDR5 memory controller figured out. Probably the main reason because 4-DIMM support is disabled. So I then tested it in my Z690 Tachyon motherboard, and please do not write in the comments, "I don't have such expensive motherboard, why are you testing it here?" I just had it. Use any motherboard with dual DIMMs, you'll be fine. I just already have it. For the memory, I'm using Patriot Extreme 8000 memory kit. It absolutely will not work in anything featured in this video at 8000 MHz. This is just to be sure I'm not memory or motherboard limited when overclocking RAM on this CPU. I need to make sure it's the memory controller limitation. I actually had a lot of help in terms of overclocking from my friend. You can find his contacts in the description. He's offering any kinds of overclocking services. And no matter how many times we tried, anything above 6200 just fails during any decent memory stress test. Also, on an ASRock motherboard, this is how the BIOS page looks with this CPU. And this is how it looks when you install a K CPU into the motherboard. And as you can see, the Fiverr configuration is missing on this CPU and ASRock motherboards, and any SA voltage changes are just ignored. ASRock motherboards think this is a non-K CPU and do not allow you to change SA voltage, while Gigabyte boards actually do allow you to change SA voltage, but it still behaves like it's a non-K CPU RAM overclocking. It just refuses to go beyond 6200 even on a decent motherboard. If we go 6400, it just almost instantly fail at any stress test. This also adds to the theory of a not fully finished memory controller. AliExpress seller actually mentions 7000 MHz memory overclocking, and though I'm saying it's not impossible, I strongly doubt any kind of serious stress tests were performed in order to confirm it's actually stable. Maybe with a golden sample and really good motherboard you can go close to 7000, provided the SA voltage is really ignored, that it just doesn't work. Most boards will not be able to reach more than, say, 6400. Now, in terms of DDR4 compatibility, everything is actually pretty great. I performed multiple tests with 2 and 4 sticks of 8GB Samsung BDI memory sticks, and in this B660GB 4DIMM motherboard, everything was fine. You might say it's only one motherboard, but I've confirmed it with multiple subscribers on my native language channel that people have no problem with this CPU on DDR4 motherboards. I didn't try to go really far with DDR4 overclocking, I just made sure everything is working properly. My memory controller allowed me 3700 MHz with 2 DIMMs, and I only tested 3400 with 4 DIMMs, but I think I can go a little bit higher. But still, with DDR4, everything just works. If you plan to go this CPU, you can select any DDR4 motherboard. If you use this CPU, please share in the comments what kind of a memory results you achieved with DDR4 and DDR5, and I'll make sure I'll pin them. Now, with all the memory questions out of the way, let's discuss how do we turn this 55 watt, I don't know, pathetic piece of CPU into a powerful, almost 12900K CPU. And the limiting factor here is the heat spreader. Because it's not soldered to the CPU, yes, there is a very good phase change thermal paste under, it's still not the same as soldering. As I already said, the original power limit is 55 and 157 in terms of PL1 and PL2. So if we remove those limitations and allow it to use as much power as it wants, we will see 155 watts power draw with P-cores at 3.8 GHz and E-cores at 3 GHz. Which is not terrible, but you would not get good gaming performance or basically any performance out of it. We need to go farther and overclock it. In order to get the stable overclock, I've disabled a lot of power saving features and actually made sure I've set the AVX offset to -1. Because if you just set it to 0, Gigabyte board does not like that, so you have to set -1. Maybe different for other motherboards, but do the same if you're not sure. Then I set P-cores to 48, which is 4.8 GHz, and E-cores to 37, which is 3.7 GHz. The max ring ratio is limited to max P-core frequency, so it's also 37. And I did not touch the voltages, just left them in auto. In most of the motherboards, without going farther than 4.8 GHz, you probably don't need to touch the voltages because it will be just fine in auto. Maybe you even want to downvolt it a bit, but if you want to go past 4.8, you will have to increase the voltage. As you can see, the power draw in this scenario is 235 watts and the CPU is actually quite stable, but we can already see the temperatures of some cores reaching 100 degrees. That is because we're limited by the heat spreader at this point, specifically the phase change under the heat spreader. And if we hit AVX instructions, then the power draw is over 260 watts and it's severely throttling at this point. The thermal compound under the heat spreader is a severe limitation at this point. With a real 12900K with soldered heat spreader, we would probably be able to reach much farther. But let's try to disable the E-course. So I'm gonna set P-course to 4.8 and ring ratio to 45 since we're not limited by the E-course anymore. And I'm still setting the voltage to auto. So the power draw in Cinebench is now 180 watts and we're holding stable 4.8 gigahertz, and the temperatures are actually quite good. But if we go AVX with a heavier stress test, we can still see that we're again thermally limited. Though it's only 210 watts, we still see 100 degrees on many cores and thermal throttling. Again, we're limited by the heat spreader and specifically the phase change thermal paste under the heat spreader. And if you're interested what kind of a Cinebench score can we get if we overclock, the answer is 27,000, which is actually quite more than the stock 12900K. So yes, Linus, it can be 12900K because it is 12900K, just a mobile version of it. The silicon is the same. If we would remove the heat spreader and use some kind of a direct die cooling solutions, we would definitely be able to reach 12900K results. Then I decided to see if an air cooler is a good solution for this kind of a CPU, and the answer is, well, it's a little complicated, but most likely yes. And with 230 watts power draw, the all-in-one actually looks a little bit better because, well, it doesn't throttle. Some cores do reach 100 degrees, but it's all 4.8 GHz and 3.7. The air cooling, the frequencies actually are a little bit lowered sometimes. But overall, it's a good solution. And with the cores disabled and only 180 watts power draw, the all-in-one actually looks a little better in terms of temperatures, but the air solution actually holds the frequencies just fine. So unless you're gonna go very far with frequencies and power draw, the air cooling is just fine. Otherwise, AEO is a little better, but if you really want to go far with this CPU, you might want to remove the heat spreader and go direct die. And many people actually think if they get this cheap-ass motherboard with more or less decent VRM and 2 sticks of RAM, I will break the system. I'll get a super cool 12900K system on the cheap. Since it ignores chipset limitations, why bother with a good motherboard? The problem is that even at 88 watts, with no airflow, the VRM would go above 100 degrees. Yeah, with some air cooling, it's gonna be a little better, but still these motherboards are usually limited around 80-90 watts of power draw by the CPU. There is no physical way such a cheap motherboard would be able to sustain a 200 plus watt load on the CPU. And this motherboard specifically has a 65 watt limitation on the CPU power draw. If you put any CPU in this ASRock motherboard, it will be limited to 65 watts. Using this motherboard for this CPU is absolutely stupid. In order to use this CPU at its full potential, you will need a good motherboard with a decent VRM with radiators. For example, this B660 Gaming X has 860 amp DRMOS, which is more than enough for this kind of CPU. And the radiators are actually quite good. Go get something like that. But you might say, I only want to game on this CPU and it's probably going to draw a lot less power, and that is true. For gaming, I actually recommend to disable the E-course, especially if you're playing Counter-Strike or Valorant. On the left you can see FPS with E-course disabled, and as you can see, it's much higher. Counter-Strike just doesn't like E-course, so you better best disable them in order to get the maximum performance, not to mention the power draw will be a little less. And it's the same thing in Valorant, we see 50% performance boost when we disable E-course. Note that many games do not benefit at all from disabling E-course, but these two do. That's why I'm going to test games with E-course disabled, and we're going to compare it in games to a 7500F. This CPU is actually very close to 7600, so they basically are identical. The clock difference is minimal, and 7600 has integrated graphics. As I already said, we're going to disable the E-course. We're only going to use 8 P-cores at 4.8 GHz with ring set to 45. We're also slightly going to overclock the 7500F, making it really close to 7600F. Max core boost will be 5250 MHz. I'm going to put it in this very affordable B650M motherboard. In terms of GPU, I'm going to use RTX 4080 Super Gaming OC from Gigabyte. The games are going to be tested in Full HD to make sure we're not GPU limited since we're testing the CPUs. And this is a quite decent GPU that actually has vapor chamber and really decent cooling. It's going to be more than enough to properly stress these CPUs in games in Full HD. The power connector on this graphics card is actually quite far into the board. That's probably to improve case compatibility. That is interesting. For both CPU, we're going to overclock the RAM. The i9 results are on the screen. It's going to be 6200 CL30. For the Ryzen, we're going to use 6200 CL28. It's also quite good memory overclock for the Ryzen. And just to make absolutely clear before we start the tests, the goal of this video is to explain to you how to properly build a system using this CPU and to avoid problems. The game benchmarks here comes a bonus to get you a rough estimation of its gaming performance. They are done before Windows 11 FPS patch for Ryzen. I cannot redo the tests now, but if I could, the Ryzen would probably have a better FPS. On the left we have the Ryzen, and on the right we have the Core i9. And if we just stand still in Valorant, the average FPS actually looks quite similar. However, the 1% lows are a little better on the Ryzen. But if we walk, the Ryzen FPS is actually quite higher. It's actually 16% better. If you just want to play Valorant, you should get a Ryzen CPU. Don't bother with this thing. Next is Counter-Strike, and if we just walk and shoot, the FPS also looks quite similar. It's only 4% difference in favor of Ryzen. But if we switch to a demo that has a very heavy scene, you can see that Core i9 is actually a lot better. I don't know why, maybe this kind of a demo favors Intel for some reason, I really don't know. Maybe it's disabling the E-cores that benefits Intel very much in this game, as we already know. Usually Ryzen CPUs beat Intel at CS2, but I guess with E-cores disabled, you really want to go Intel. Or maybe it's the extra 2 cores that benefited very much in this game. I don't really know. Next is Wukong, and I kind of failed in this game. I've set the settings to high, and we're very much GPU limited in this game. Full HD high settings, and we're limited by 4080 Super. What a game. In this game, I guess you need a 4090 to compare, even at high settings, any CPUs that are half decent. Next is Assassin's Creed Mirage, and here, well, Intel looks a little bit better than Ryzen. The FPS is still great, but Intel is 14% ahead from its competition. And guys, to be clear, this CPU is just 12th gen. The cores are proper, they're not any kind of engineering cores, early versions, it's proper 12th gen, so the results are expected. If you plan to fight for democracy against bots and automatons, you better choose i9, because it's 13% faster in this game than the Ryzen. Again, both CPUs provide great results at 4080 Super in this game, just i9 is a little better. In Baldur's Gate 3, the FPS difference is 15% in favor of i9. Maybe it's the extra 2 cores, maybe the game just likes Intel more, I don't really know. And you probably see the pattern here, it's just faster in most of the games, though not by much, but still it's 5 to 15% faster almost every time. It's the same thing for Remnant 2, it's 8% faster than the Ryzen, which is still not a lot, but it's a clear victory. Now to be clear, we're only testing in Full HD. If we crank up the resolution, the difference would be much lower. It would probably be 0 to maybe a few percent difference if you ask me. Now that we understand its gaming performance, returning to that LTT video, we understand that it should have destroyed all the competition in games. But because they never said how it's configured, and it's probably set in default with power limits disabled, and paired with 4060, it's obviously not gonna show any earth-shattering results. They also tested in Cinebench in this video, where they only get the result of 19,500 points. So we can safely assume it's motherboard limited and not overclocked, or only slightly overclocked by the guy who built it. They actually say in the video that...
But the professional promised that that had the same performance as a 12900K.
And we already know it can deliver above 12900K performance, it's just the guy who built the system chose a bad motherboard and probably didn't overclock it. So, considering everything you just saw, should you buy this CPU for games? And the answer is, I'm not sure. Ryzen is a lot more user-friendly to operate and install and doesn't require overclocking out of the box. So that's the question for you to answer, I guess. Now to answer the big question, should you use an H610 motherboard as a gaming motherboard for this kind of CPU? The power draw is around 100 watts for most games, and many motherboards would probably be able to handle it, but the VRM temps would be horrible. I do not recommend a 610 motherboard, just get something slightly more decent with VRM rats. Okay, now that we know the performance and we've seen it in gaming, is it worth it? Is it worth for work or for whatever you plan to use it? And the answer is maybe. At least for work, it's probably an interesting choice since it's only 150 US and you get almost 12900K performance. But considering you cannot use it in every motherboard in terms of DDR5 motherboards, and it has a lot of, let's say, installation problems and many other problems you might occur, and that you need to actually enter BIOS and overclock it to get its full performance, it's probably the CPU for you if you consider yourself a PC enthusiast and you know what to do with it. As for an average person who just wants to build a decent PC and game on it, I do not recommend you go this path. And though the gaming tests look compelling, as I already mentioned, I had this CPU before the Windows 11 patch and I don't have it right now, and I cannot redo the tests against Ryzen. The Ryzen would probably do slightly better because that Windows 11 patch really increased the FPS in many games. So buying this CPU for gaming it's probably not worth it, at least in my opinion. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe, leave a like and comment, and feel free to ask any question. See you in the next one.